The cafeteria went silent the moment. Sergeant First Class Marcus Teal picked up his tray and dumped it deliberately, slowly, making sure every soldier in the room was watching directly onto the woman standing in front of him. Hot soup cascaded down her scrubs. Coffee spread across the floor. A bowl clattered and rolled until it stopped against someone's boot. 50 soldiers stared. Not one moved. The woman it happened to didn't flinch, didn't gasp, didn't step back. She looked down at the mess, soaking through her uniform, then looked up at the man who'd done it and said, in a voice completely absent of trembling, "Remember this moment." "I will." Nobody laughed. Nobody spoke. Because something in her eyes made even the sergeant go still. Before this story goes any further, if you've never been here before, hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel is where stories like this live. Real drama, real reversals, real moments where the person everyone wrote off turns out to be the one holding everything together. Hit like if you're already feeling it, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning, because what happened at Harlow Peak Military Medical Center in the weeks that followed that cafeteria moment was something none of those 50 soldiers would ever stop talking about. Harlow Peak Military Medical Center sat at the edge of a town called Duskfield, Montana, the kind of place where the wind came off the mountains like it had somewhere urgent to be and never quite arrived. The facility was functional, rather than impressive concrete blocks, fluorescent corridors, a parking lot that half froze between October and April, served 2 infantry battalions, a logistics regiment, and a rotating population of support staff that came and went with the seasons. Nurse Serena Voss had arrived 6 weeks earlier on a quiet transfer request from a base she never discussed. She was 33, medium height, with dark circles under her eyes that suggested either chronic overtime or chronic insomnia. And she never clarified which. She had a way of moving through a hallway that took up very little space, her footsteps almost soundless on the linoleum, her expression professionally neutral in a way that people sometimes mistook for emptiness. Her assignment at Harlow Peak was officially listed as supply and inventory coordination. In practical terms, that meant she managed the pharmaceutical stock, reconciled shipment records, tracked equipment usage, and kept the shelves organized. It was not glamorous work. Most of the clinical staff treated her the way people treat the person who fixes the copy machine, grateful when things work, invisible when they don't. She had a small office behind the main supply room, barely large enough for a desk, and 2 filing cabinets. The window faced a concrete wall. She had put nothing personal on the surfaces. No photos, no plants, a single coffee mug that said nothing on it. Within her first 2 weeks, she had quietly restructured the entire inventory system. Nobody noticed. The soldiers stationed at Harlow Peak were a particular breed men and women who had done things in places that didn't appear on official maps and had come back carrying weight they weren't permitted to describe. They were not unkind people, most of them. But they had a hierarchy of respect that was built entirely on visible toughness, and Serena Voss, with her silent footsteps and her supply clipboards, did not register anywhere on it. Marcus Teal was the one who set the tone. He was Sergeant First Class, 11 years of infantry service, 2 combat deployments, and the kind of chest-forward confidence that fills a room before the person does. He was not universally liked, but he was universally respected, which, in a military environment, sometimes amounts to the same thing. He'd had a run-in with Serena in her 2nd week when she'd flagged an irregularity in the controlled medication log. A discrepancy, he insisted, was a clerical error from the previous quarter. She had simply said she would need the original requisition forms to reconcile it. He had told her to focus on stacking shelves and let people with actual qualifications handle medical records. She had said nothing back, just written it down. That seemed to irritate him more than any argument would have. Cafeteria incident happened on a Thursday morning in November. Serena had been standing in line for coffee, clipboard under one arm, running through a mental checklist of the morning's inventory discrepancies. There had been more than usual lately when Marcus Teal came through behind her with a full tray. She'd turned slightly to move out of his way, and he'd said, loudly enough for the room to hear, "Move faster, Voss. Some of us actually have places to be." Taken one step, and he'd tilted his tray. It was not an accident. The angle was too precise. The speed was too deliberate. Hot soup, lukewarm coffee, someone's leftover eggs, all of it hit her in the chest and shoulder, soaked through her scrubs in seconds, and splattered across the floor in a radius that left her standing in it. Someone inhaled sharply. Somebody else's fork scraped a plate and then stopped. Serena looked down. She looked up. "Remember this moment," she said. "I will." She walked to the supply closet, changed into a spare set of scrubs, and was back at her desk reviewing shipment records within 15 minutes. She did not file a complaint. She did not mention it to anyone. She simply wrote the date in the small notebook she kept in her breast pocket, underlined it once, and returned to work. Marcus Teal told the story in the common room that evening, like it was funny. Most people laughed. One person didn't, a younger medic named Priya Halston, 26 years old, 2 years at Harlow Peak, who had been sitting at a back table in the cafeteria and had watched Serena's face in the moment after it happened. Not the calm expression. Something behind it. Something that Priya couldn't name, but recognized instinctively as the face of someone choosing very deliberately not to show you what they're actually thinking. She thought about it for 3 days before she went to knock on the supply room door. Serena was in the middle of a printout when Priya appeared in the doorway. Rows of numbers, highlighted in 3 different colors. She didn't look up immediately. "Can I help you?" "I just wanted to—" Priya started, then stopped. "I don't know. I wanted to make sure you were okay." "What happened?" Serena set down her highlighter. "I'm fine." "He does that to people," Priya said. "Teal. He finds whoever's lowest on his personal ranking system. And she gestured vaguely. "He's been here long enough that nobody stops him." "I know." Serena picked the highlighter back up. "Thank you for coming." Priya hesitated in the doorway. She looked at the printouts on the desk, all those highlighted numbers, and something made her ask, "What are you working on?" Pause before the answer was just slightly too long. "Inventory reconciliation," Serena said. "It's overdue." Priya looked at the papers again. She was a medic, not an administrator, but she'd seen standard inventory forms before. These didn't look like standard anything. The columns were too dense, the highlighted sections too specifically clustered. "Okay," she said. "I'm in the East Wing most days. If you need anything." Serena nodded. After Priya left, she sat for a moment, then turned back to the printout, dragged the highlighter slowly across another row, and circled a number in the margin. It was the 4th time that number had appeared in the wrong place. The missing supplies had begun to show up in the data approximately 8 months before Serena's arrival, though the pattern was subtle enough that it had been absorbed into the noise of normal operational variance. Pharmaceutical stock that should have been replenished arrived short. Equipment listed as expended had no corresponding usage records. Controlled medications showed consumption rates that didn't match patient volume. Whoever had built the system had been careful. Not careful enough, there were always threads, always the one row, that didn't reconcile, no matter how many ways you ran it, but careful enough to survive 3 standard audits and 2 quarterly reviews without triggering a single flag. Serena had been looking at it for 6 weeks. She had found 27 separate anomalies. She'd mapped them across a timeline that went back 14 months. Cross-referenced them with shift logs, access records, and external shipment manifests. And what she was beginning to see was not a disorganized series of mistakes. It was a network, a structured, deliberate system for redirecting military medical supplies away from official inventory and into channels that had no paperwork. The scale was not enormous. Whoever was running it had the sense to keep each individual extraction small enough to be plausible as human error. But across 14 months, the cumulative loss was significant. Trauma medications, surgical kits, high-value controlled substances, things that had black market value far outside any military facility. Kept the findings in an encrypted folder on a drive that stayed in her pocket. She told no one. Because the access logs told her something important. To reroute these supplies, whoever was responsible would need credentials at a level that most of the staff didn't possess. And that meant the thread, if she pulled it far enough, was going to lead somewhere that would make people very uncomfortable. She needed more before she moved. Marcus Teal came to her office 4 days after the cafeteria incident. He didn't knock. He filled the doorway with the specific energy of someone who considers their presence sufficient announcement, and he looked around the small room with the expression of someone inspecting something he found mildly distasteful. "I need to talk to you about your reports," he said. Serena swiveled her chair to face him. "Which reports?" "The inventory flags you've been sending to the pharmacy director. She's been getting calls about it." People are saying you're creating problems where there aren't any. If there were no problems, the numbers would reconcile, Serena said. Every facility has variances. That's normal. You're not experienced enough in a military medical environment to understand what's standard and what isn't. She looked at him steadily. I've reconciled inventories at 3 different facilities. The variance pattern here is not standard. His jaw moved slightly. He hadn't expected pushback. You need to understand how things work here, Voss. There's a chain of command and a way of doing things. And when civilian contractors come in and start making accusations, I'm not a civilian contractor. He stopped. She held his gaze. And I'm not making accusations. I'm flagging irregularities. It's my job. Your job, he said slowly, is to keep the shelves stocked and make sure the paperwork doesn't fall behind. Nobody asked for a full forensic audit. Nobody needed to ask, she said. I noticed. I documented. I reported. She paused. Is there something specific you'd like me to change about that process? The silence between them stretched thin. You should think carefully, he said, about how hard you want to push on things you don't fully understand. She didn't answer. He left. She turned back to her desk and wrote the conversation down: date, time, the specific words he'd used. Then she added a new column to her timeline spreadsheet, labeled it interference, and made her first entry. The situation with Priya Halston developed slowly, the way most real things do, not dramatically, but in small accumulations. Priya began stopping by the supply office more frequently. Not every day, but enough. She'd bring coffee sometimes, or ask a logistics question she probably already knew the answer to, and gradually, over 2 weeks, she started staying a few minutes longer each visit. Serena was careful about what she shared. She was careful about everything, but Priya was sharp in the way that people who've been underestimated develop sharpness as a survival tool, as a precision instrument. And she began to piece things together, not because Serena told her, because she paid attention. Something's wrong with the supply chain, Priya said one afternoon. It wasn't a question. Serena took a long moment. What makes you say that? Because I requested a surgical trauma kit for a field training exercise last month, and what came back was missing 2 of the primary components. And when I flagged it, the duty officer told me the kit had been fully stocked according to records. She paused. Records that I pulled myself, and they didn't match the physical inventory. Did you report it? I reported it to Lieutenant Gordon Ashby. He told me it was a logging error and had it corrected the following day. She met Serena's eyes. Correction erased my original report. The room was quiet for a moment. I'm not asking you to tell me what you're working on, Priya said. I'm just telling you what I saw. Because it feels like someone should know. Serena studied her for a moment. Then she turned back to the printout on her desk. If you notice anything else that doesn't match, discrepancies between physical stock and system records, corrections that appear after you file reports, anything, write it down. Don't enter it into any system here. Write it on paper, date it, and keep it somewhere off this base. Priya was quiet for a second. Okay, she said. Don't tell anyone else. Okay, I mean that specifically, I understand. Priya picked up her coffee cup. She was almost at the door when she turned back. How long have you been doing this? Serena's eyes stayed on the paper. Since before I got here. Priya walked out and didn't ask any more questions. The pressure from Teal escalated the following week. He wasn't subtle about it. He began routing routine supply requests around her, going directly to the pharmacy director and bypassing the standard process, which created duplicate orders and sent her reconciliation work backwards by several days. When she flagged the duplicates, the pharmacy director, a cautious, overworked major named Diane Fawcett, pulled Serena aside and suggested, gently but firmly, that perhaps the current inventory protocols were creating unnecessary friction. Marcus has mentioned to me that some of the staff are feeling like their work is being second-guessed, Fawcett said. She had the tone of someone delivering a message they didn't write. I'm not saying your work isn't thorough, but there are ways to be thorough that don't create a hostile working environment. Serena kept her expression neutral. Has a formal complaint been filed? Formally. But then I'd like to address any concerns through the formal process. She folded her hands on the desk. I'm happy to adjust my communication style if there's a specific issue, but the inventory flags themselves are based on documented discrepancies. Can't remove them without resolving the underlying data. Fawcett looked at her for a long moment with the expression of someone who genuinely didn't know what to do with a person who wouldn't soften. I'm just letting you know, she said finally. that you should be thoughtful about relationships here. People have long memories. So do I, Serena said. Forsett left looking vaguely unsettled. Later that afternoon, Serena found that her system access had been downgraded. She could still view inventory records, but the export function, which she had been using to build her comparison files, had been disabled. Pulled out her notebook, added the date, wrote access restriction and the specific functions affected. Then she went to Priya's station and borrowed a scanner. She spent the next 3 evenings photographing every physical printout she'd accumulated, every highlighted anomaly, every reconciliation discrepancy, every cross-referenced shipment manifest. She stored the images on a drive that had never touched the facility's network. By the end of the 3rd evening, she had documentation for 31 separate irregularities spanning 16 months. She also had something she hadn't expected. A pattern in the access logs that pointed not to a single person, but to a specific credential set that had been used across multiple transactions, a credential set that belonged, according to the system's own records, to someone whose name appeared on no staff directory at Harlow Peak, a ghost credential. Someone had created a user account that didn't officially exist and had been routing supply extractions through it for over a year. Creating that kind of credential required administrator-level access to the hospital's supply management system. There were exactly 3 people at Harlow Peak with that level of access. Serena sat back in her chair. She looked at the list. She looked at it for a long time. Confrontation she hadn't expected came from a direction she'd underestimated. Lieutenant Gordon Ashby appeared at her office door on a Wednesday morning, the same Ashby who had erased Priya's report, and he came without the bluntness of Teal or the diplomacy of Forsett. He came quiet, which was somehow worse. He was 41, lean, with the kind of face that had learned to reveal very little. Closed the door behind him, which nobody else had done. "You've been requesting physical access to archived shipment records," he said. "The archive is part of my inventory reconciliation duties. Specific records you requested date back over a year. That's outside the scope of a routine reconciliation. Routine reconciliation flagged discrepancies that required historical comparison," she said. "The archive is the appropriate place to find historical records." He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone thinking, quiet of someone deciding. "Voss," he said, "I'm going to be direct with you. There are people in this facility who think you've overstepped. I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here to tell you that if you push this further without proper authorization, you will create a situation that is very difficult to walk back from." She met his eyes. "What situation would that be?" "Accusations." He said it simply. "Formal or informal, they follow people, especially people who are new to a posting and have already created friction." "I haven't accused anyone of anything," she said. "I've flagged data discrepancies. Fine distinction. It's the correct one." He studied her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not angry, not nervous. Something more calculated than either. "You don't understand who you're dealing with," he said. Serena held his gaze without blinking. "I understand exactly what I'm looking at." The words sat between them. He left without another word. She waited until she heard his footsteps disappear down the corridor. Then she opened her encrypted drive, navigated to a subfolder she'd labeled Priority, and added Gordon Ashby's name to a list that already had 2 other names on it. All 3 of them had administrator-level access to the supply management system. She needed to know which one had created the ghost credential. She needed to know who else they were working with. And she was getting close enough that they could feel it, which meant the window she had left was shrinking. Picked up her notebook, turned to a clean page, and began mapping everything she knew against everything she still needed to find, in the careful, methodical way of someone who has done this kind of work before, in places where getting it wrong had consequences that made a hostile sergeant and a downgraded access account look like minor inconveniences. She worked until midnight. When she finally locked the office and walked to the residential quarters, the corridor was empty. The lights were on their night cycle, half-dimmed, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor. She was halfway to her room when she noticed something. The door to her office, which she had just locked, was showing a light gap at the bottom. She hadn't left a light on. She stopped in the corridor, stood very still, listened. Footsteps inside her office, moving carefully, slowly, in the specific way of someone who wants very much not to be heard. Someone was in there right now, going through her things. Serena didn't move. She stood in the corridor with the light gap at the bottom of her door and did the thing that training had made involuntary. She took a single slow breath and assessed. Not panicked, not rushing. Just reading the situation the way she'd been taught to read every situation, which was, before you act, know what you're acting into. The light inside was dim. The gap wasn't bright enough for an overhead, it was the desk lamp. The small one she kept angled toward the back wall. Whoever was in there had been careful enough not to hit the main switch, which meant they didn't want anyone in the corridor to notice from a distance. They'd locked the door behind them, which meant they had a key or had bypassed the lock, both of which narrowed the list considerably. And they were moving slowly, not ransacking, not tearing through drawers, which meant they were looking for something specific. Printouts. She exhaled once quietly. Then she turned around, walked back down the corridor at a normal pace, pushed through the side exit door, and went outside into the cold. The Montana air hit her face like a flat palm. It was just past midnight, and the temperature had dropped below freezing. She didn't stop to button her jacket. She crossed the side lot, rounded the building, and came up to the exterior wall of the supply wing. Her office window was the third from the left, ground floor. The blind was pulled. A thin line of yellow light showed underneath it. She stood in the dark and watched the light for 40 seconds. Then she took out her phone and called the only number she'd added to it since arriving at Harlow Peak. Priya picked up on the second ring, groggy and confused. "Hello? I need you to do something right now," Serena said. "Don't ask questions until I finish." A pause. Then fully awake. "Okay. I need you to go to the East Wing Nurses Station. Shared terminal there, public access, not tied to individual credentials. I need you to pull the facility access log for the supply wing, tonight, last 2 hours. Screenshot everything and send it to the number I'm calling from. Can you do that?" Priya was already moving. Serena could hear the sound of her getting out of bed. "Yeah. Give me 4 minutes. Don't use your own login to pull it." Another pause. Then the terminal has a guest audit function. User's name is audit guest. Password is the facility's postal code plus the last 4 of the base registration number. For external contractors. It hasn't been disabled. She'd found it 3 weeks ago while cross-referencing access architecture documents. She'd hoped she wouldn't need it. Go, she hung up, stayed outside in the cold. Not because there was nothing to do, but because going back inside before she knew who was in that room would be a mistake. If she walked in and it was someone low-level, a junior staff member, running someone else's errand, she'd show her hand for nothing. If it was someone with actual authority, the confrontation needed to happen on ground she chose, not ground they'd already occupied. Her phone buzzed. Screenshots from the guest terminal. She opened them in the cold, fingers going stiff, and scrolled through the access log. Her office had been entered at 11:47 p.m. using a keycard registered to maintenance, a generic designation that covered any of a dozen facility staff, unremarkable on its own, the kind of access that wouldn't raise a flag in any standard review. But 2 entries above it, at 11:31 p.m., the log showed a secondary system query. Someone's had run a search on her employee profile from a terminal in the administrative corridor. Her credentials, her transfer documentation, her facility clearances. Query was logged under a credential she recognized. Gordon Ashby. He hadn't come to her office to threaten her and then walked away. Come to her office to get a look at what she was working on. And when he couldn't get what he needed from the conversation, he'd sent someone in after she left. She stood in the dark with the phone in her hand and the cold coming through her jacket and thought, clearly and without drama, this is no longer just about supply records. She went back inside through the main entrance and walked directly to the pharmacy director's office, not to find Forsett, who wouldn't be there at midnight, but because it was the only office on the administrative wing she had legitimate reason to access at any hour, documented by her standing authorization to cross-check pharmaceutical records against inventory logs. She went in, sat down at the desk, and used the terminal there to run a search she'd been putting off. The ghost credential, the administrator account, with no staff record attached, had been used for the first time 14 months ago. She'd known that. What she hadn't fully traced was the creation date. It had been created 16 months ago, 2 months before the first extraction. Whoever set it up had planned. They'd built the infrastructure before they started using it, which meant this wasn't opportunistic. It had been designed. Someone had looked at the facility's systems, identified the gap, built a workaround, tested it, and then started running extractions carefully enough to stay beneath the threshold that triggered automatic audits. That kind of operational planning didn't come from someone who stumbled into corruption. It came from someone who understood institutional systems well enough to exploit them deliberately. She pulled up the list of personnel who had been at Harlow Peak 16 months ago and cross-referenced it against the 3 names with administrator access. 2 of those 3 had been here at that time. One of them was Gordon Ashby. The other was Colonel Raymond Veck, the facility's commanding officer. She sat with that for a moment. She had been trying not to let her thinking go in that direction, because the direction was significant, and she needed to be certain before she even formed the possibility into a clear thought. A commanding officer meant a completely different set of resources, a completely different kind of authority over information flow, and a completely different order of difficulty in terms of what happened next. She saved nothing to the terminal. She memorized what she needed, cleared the search history, and left the office the way she'd found it. When she walked back past her own office, the light gap at the bottom of the door was gone. Whoever had been inside had left. She unlocked the door and went in. The room looked exactly as she'd left it, same papers on the desk, same filing position on the cabinets, nothing visibly disturbed, which was exactly the problem. A professional search leaves things looking undisturbed. She stood in the center of the room and did a slow visual check, then went to the second filing cabinet and opened the bottom drawer. The dummy folder she'd planted there, a folder containing nothing but blank printed pages in a convincing arrangement, had been moved. Not by much. An inch. But the edge no longer aligned with the small scratch she'd made on the cabinet interior 6 days ago when she first set it up. They'd found the dummy and taken the bait, which meant they now believed she was keeping her primary findings in a physical file in this office. She was not. Everything real was on the drive in her jacket pocket. Everything in this office was either blank or deliberately incomplete enough to look substantive, not enough to tell anyone anything useful. She sat down at her desk. It was 12:41 a.m. She had a briefing at 730 and a supply reconciliation meeting at 900 that she expected Ashby would use to create another obstacle. She needed 3 more things before she could make a move: positive confirmation on the ghost credentials origin, documentation of the Ashby search query in a format that couldn't be dismissed as her word against his, and a contact outside this facility that she could trust. The third one was the hardest. She opened her notebook, turned to the back page, looked at a phone number written there in pencil, a number she'd been given before she left her last posting by a man who'd told her, without elaborating, that if something went significantly wrong, this was who she should call. She'd been avoiding it because calling it meant admitting the situation had moved outside what she could handle quietly, and she was still not sure it had. But someone had been in her office. Gordon Ashby had run her credentials, and she was looking at the possibility that the commanding officer of this facility was involved. She stared at the number for a long moment. Then she put the notebook away without calling it. Not yet. Not until she had the third piece. The 900 meeting the next morning was in the administrative conference room. A long table, bad lighting, a whiteboard that someone had never properly cleaned, so old marker text ghosted through whatever you wrote. Forsett was there. 2 logistics officers Serena didn't know well, and Ashby, who came in last and sat directly across from her without acknowledging her presence. The meeting was framed as a routine supply chain review. Within the first 10 minutes, it became clear it was not. One of the logistics officers, a captain named Miles Sutter, opened a printed report and slid copies around the table. "We've been looking at the inventory tracking process, and we think there are some inefficiencies in how discrepancy reports are being generated," he said in the careful tone of someone reading from a script, specifically around the volume of flags being raised for what ultimately resolve as standard variants. Serena looked at the report. It was a summary of her own flags, reframed as a process problem. "The recommendation," Sutter continued, "is to implement a secondary review threshold. Discrepancies below a certain dollar value wouldn't generate formal flags. They'd go into a review queue that gets checked quarterly." She kept her expression even. A quarterly review queue would bury every single anomaly she'd documented. By the time anything surfaced, the extraction trail would be cold. "What's the threshold?" she asked. "We're looking at individual transaction values under $800. The majority of the discrepancies I've logged are under $800 per transaction," she said. They're significant because they recur across dozens of transactions. Right, but individually they look like variants, she said, which is presumably the point. The room went quiet. Sutter looked down at his report. Forsett looked at the table. Ashby looked at Serena with an expression that was almost admirably controlled. I think what Nurse Voss is raising, he said, is a concern about cumulative patterns, which is valid, but it's also the kind of analysis that belongs in a quarterly audit, not a continuous flag process that creates daily disruption. The pattern only gets reviewed quarterly. It takes 9 to 12 months to confirm, Serena said. By then, the transactions that created it are outside the standard correction window. That's a process concern we can address through audit design, Ashby said smoothly. The goal here is to streamline, not to eliminate oversight. She looked at him. He looked back at her. The two of them conducted an entire conversation in that look that had nothing to do with anything being said out loud. I'd like to see the proposal in writing before any changes are implemented, she said. And I'd like the opportunity to submit a formal response. Sutter glanced at Ashby. Ashby nodded. In the manner of someone granting a concession, they're confident will ultimately be ignored. Absolutely. We'll circulate the written proposal this week. The meeting ended. Serena collected her copy of the report, folded it into thirds, and slid it into her jacket pocket as she left. She had 3 days, maybe 4, before the threshold proposal got pushed through. After that, the legitimate pathway to raising flags internally would be functionally closed. She was walking back toward the supply wing when Priya fell into step beside her from a side corridor, which took her slightly by surprise. She hadn't heard her coming. How'd it go? Priya asked low. They're trying to restructure the reporting process, Serena said without slowing. Goes through. Anything I flag going forward gets deprioritized automatically. Priya was quiet for a moment. So they know you're close. They've known I was close. Now they're moving to contain it formally instead of informally. She pushed through the door into the supply corridor, which means the informal options are running out. What do you need? Serena stopped at her office door. She looked at Priya, really looked at her, the way she hadn't let herself before, and made a decision that felt slightly like stepping off a ledge. The access log you pulled last night, she said. Can you pull it again? Every entry for the administrative corridor terminal, going back 30 days. Yeah. Don't do it from the guest account again. That account may have already been flagged. She thought for a second. Is there anyone you trust completely at the nurses' station? Someone who's had no contact with Ashby or Sutter, Priya thought. Yemi Adara. She's been here 8 months. She mostly runs the night desk. Ashby barely knows her name. Can she pull it without drawing attention? If I ask her. Yeah, ask her. Serena unlocked her office. And Priya, she turned in the doorway. Don't explain why. Just ask her to do it as a favor. Priya nodded and left without another word. The records came back that afternoon through a photographed printout that Priya left in an unmarked envelope on the edge of Serena's desk, which was a method she'd never suggested, but which showed a level of instinctive, operational thinking that Serena found both reassuring and slightly uncomfortable. She went through the administrative terminal logs, the same way she went through everything, methodically, line by line, without rushing. There were 41 terminal sessions over 30 days. Most were mundane. 8 were clustered in a pattern she recognized: short duration, identical query format, run at times when the administrative corridor would be quiet. All 8 used the same credential, not Ashby's credential. Supply officer named Lieutenant Tara Oakes. Serena sat back. She didn't know Oakes well. They'd crossed paths twice, both times briefly. Oakes was mid-30s, efficient, largely unremarkable in the specific way that people sometimes cultivate as protective coloring. She worked supply logistics from the administrative side, managing contracts and vendor relationships rather than physical inventory, which would give her access to shipment documentation without her presence in the physical supply area being conspicuous. Serena pulled Oakes's access credentials from the public staff directory and cross-referenced them against her timeline. Tara Oakes's credential profile had been created 21 months ago when she first arrived at Harlow Peak. Standard. Nothing unusual. But one of her access permission sets had been modified 16 months ago, modified to include administrator-level access to the supply management system. The modification was logged under Raymond Veck's authorization code. Serena set the papers down on her desk. She looked at the wall. She looked at it for a long time. 3 people. Vec had given Oakes the access. Oakes had created the ghost credential and run the logistics side. Ashby was managing interference, keeping internal reports suppressed, flagging anyone who got close, and restructuring oversight processes to maintain cover. 3 people in a structure that was clean enough to survive multiple audits and organized enough to plan 2 months ahead of the first extraction. This was not a crime of opportunity. This was an operation. She picked up her notebook, turned to the back page, looked at the penciled number again. This time she picked up her phone. It rang 4 times. Then a voicemail, unhurried, with the specific flatness of someone who has learned to be unreadable even over a phone line. "Who is this?" "Voss," she said. "You told me to call if it became significant." A brief pause. "How significant?" "Commanding officer level," she said. 18 months of operation. Systematic. There's a ghost credential, and I have the modification authorization trail. Another pause. Longer. "Are you secure right now?" "Can be." "Don't move anything. Don't approach anyone at the facility. I need 72 hours. I have 3 days before they restructure the internal reporting process and bury the flag trail," she said. "Then we're aligned." The voice didn't change in tone. "Don't do anything that makes them move faster." The call ended. Put her phone away and looked at the wall again. 72 hours. She needed to keep operating normally, keep showing up to her desk, keep filing routine paperwork, keep giving the impression that the meeting this morning had slowed her down. She needed Marcus Teal to keep thinking she was a paperwork nurse with a filing problem. She needed Ashby to keep thinking the dummy folder in the bottom cabinet was her primary concern. She needed 3 more days of looking like someone who had almost been stopped. It was not a comfortable position. She was good at it, but that didn't make it comfortable. She was halfway through reconstructing a cross-reference shipment, logged the real one, from memory and photographs, not the falsified system record when her office door opened without a knock. She had time to slide the papers under the desk blotter before she looked up. It was Marcus Teal. He looked different from the morning of the cafeteria incident. Not less confident, that wasn't something that seemed to leave him, but there was something beneath the confidence that she hadn't seen before. Something operating at a different frequency than his usual bluntness. "You were in the meeting this morning," he said. "I was." He didn't sit down. He stood in front of the desk with his arms at his sides, which was unusual. Teal was a man who occupied space aggressively, hands on hips, feet wide, leaning into things. Standing straight with his arms down was for him almost a posture of restraint. "The threshold proposal," he said. "Sutter's thing." "Yes, whose idea was it?" She studied him. "Why are you asking me?" "'Cause you were the one it was designed to hit." He looked at her directly. "I'm not an idiot, Voss. I've been here 2 years. I know what a meeting looks like when it's built around neutralizing one specific person, and that meeting this morning was built around you." She was quiet for a moment. And I want to know why." He pulled out the chair across from her desk and sat down without being invited. "Spent 6 weeks making your life difficult because I thought you were a civilian bureaucrat who didn't know what she was doing and was creating problems for a system that was working fine." He paused. "But a system that's working fine doesn't need a meeting like that to shut one nurse down." She looked at him. He wasn't performing. He wasn't positioning. He was doing what she recognized as a genuinely uncomfortable thing for a man like him, admitting that he might have had the picture wrong. "I can't tell you what I'm working on," she said. "I'm not asking you to." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm asking if you're in a situation where you need someone to have your back." Question sat in the air between them. She thought about it honestly. Not about trust. She didn't trust him, not yet, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise, but about usefulness. Marcus Teal was Sergeant First Class. He had 2 years of relationship capital at this facility. He had access to spaces and conversations that she didn't, and, if the next 72 hours went sideways, in any of a dozen ways she could imagine, having someone with a different kind of standing might matter. "If you want to be useful," she said carefully, "don't change anything you're doing. Go on operating exactly as you have been. If anyone asks about me, say what you've been saying." Blinked. "That you're in over your head?" "That I'm a paperwork nurse who's creating friction," she said. "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment, with an expression that cycled through several things she couldn't entirely read. Then he stood up from the chair. "Okay," he said. "Don't tell anyone about this conversation." Obviously. He walked to the door, then stopped. He didn't turn around. "For what it's worth," he said, "I've been an ass to you. I know that. Yes, she said. He left. She sat in the quiet of her office and turned back to the papers under the blotter. Added Teal's visit to her notebook, dated and timed, flagged as potential asset, unconfirmed. Then she went back to the shipment log reconstruction and worked until the light outside the window went from gray to black. Careful. She was thorough. She was the most dangerous thing a corrupt system can encounter, someone who is patient, who is keeping good records, and who has already called the people who can do something about it. 72 hours. She checked her drive one more time, confirmed the encryption, and slid it back into her pocket. She was reaching for her jacket to leave when her phone buzzed. Not a call. A message from an unknown number. 3 words. No context. They know you called. She read the message 3 times. They know you called. No name, no sender. No context beyond the 3 words sitting on her screen in the specific blankness of an unknown number that would trace back to a prepaid or a relay and tell her nothing useful. She didn't waste time trying. Instead, she read the message again and thought about what it actually told her, which was 2 things. First, that her call had been monitored, which meant either her phone or the line on the receiving end had been compromised. Second, that whoever had sent this warning had access to the same monitoring, which meant they were inside the same system that was watching her, and had chosen to flag it. Not a threat, a warning. She forwarded the message to the number she'd called, then powered the phone off, pulled the SIM, and put both pieces in separate pockets. It wouldn't help much if the monitoring was at the network level, but it was better than leaving an active signal running. She sat for exactly 90 seconds and thought. The 72-hour window had just collapsed. If Vec and Ashby knew she'd made contact outside the facility, they would move fast, not cautiously, not through the bureaucratic mechanisms they'd been using so far. They'd move the way people move when they realize the careful approach has stopped working. She'd seen it before. The shift from containment to elimination was usually fast, and usually looked legitimate on paper emergency transfer requests, sudden performance reviews, administrative holds on access credentials. All of it deniable, all of it effective. She had hours, not days. She put her jacket on, pocketed the drive, and left the office. Priya's room was in the residential block on the east side of the facility. Serena knocked twice, soft and fast, and Priya opened the door in 15 seconds, which meant she'd either been awake or she slept like someone who'd learned to come to full alertness quickly. She was in civilian clothes, a long-sleeved shirt, socks, and her eyes were already sharp before Serena said a word. Something happened, Priya said. Not a question. I need you to listen, and then I need you to make a decision, Serena said. Not for me, for yourself. She told her enough. Not everything. She didn't give names above Ashby, and she didn't explain where her original assignment had come from, but she told her the shape of it, the network, the ghost credential, Vex authorization, call she'd made, and the message that followed. She told her. The timeline had compressed. She told her that anyone associated with the investigation was now potentially a target for administrative retaliation. Priya sat on the edge of her bed and listened without interrupting. When Serena finished, Priya said, "What do you need from me right now?" "Nothing. I'm telling you to think about whether you want to stay visible on this. I already pulled logs for you. I'm already visible." You could argue that was routine. Nothing you've done so far is unambiguous. And if I step back, you protect yourself. Serena held her gaze. Genuinely. I'm not saying this to make you feel guilty for considering it. Priya looked at the floor. She chewed the inside of her cheek, a habit Serena had noticed, the thing she did when she was thinking hard about something she didn't like. Then she looked up. What are you going to do in the next 3 hours? Get everything I have off this base through a channel they can't intercept. How? Physical transfer. I need to get the drive and the documentation out of here and into hands that are already expecting it, without using any communication system that could be monitored from inside the facility. Priya was quiet for a second. The supply convoy leaves at 400, she said. External contractors, goes into Duskfield proper. Yemi Adara's brother-in-law drives it. He's not military. Serena looked at her. You're sure about that? He complains about the early hours every time she mentions him. He's a civilian contractor, purely logistics. Doesn't fall under the facility's communication monitoring. She paused. Can ask Yemi to ask him to carry something. If it goes wrong, Yemi would do it for me, and he won't know what he's carrying. Priya stood up. Tell me what you need packaged. The next hour and a half was the most methodical work Serena had done since arriving at Harlow Peak. She went back to her office, keeping her pace and her expression identical to any other late-night return head down. Coffee cup in hand, nothing broadcasting urgency. She printed the core documentation, the ghost credential trail, the modification authorization under VEX code, the timeline cross-reference, the Ashby query logs that Yemi had pulled, the shipment manifest discrepancies across 16 months. She collated them in order, no annotations, just the raw data that a competent investigator could read without interpretation. She made 2 copies, wrapped each in a plain manila envelope, sealed them. The drive went into a small USB sleeve. She tucked that inside the first envelope. The second envelope she addressed to the number's associated contact, a name and post office box she'd been given at her previous posting, not electronic, strictly physical, which was a detail she'd found oddly cautious at the time and was now grateful for. She walked the envelope to Priya's room, said nothing except 400. Priya took it without a word. Then Serena went back to her office and sat in the dark and waited. 230, her door opened. She'd left it unlocked. She'd done this deliberately, because locking it at this hour would signal to anyone watching the access logs that she was in there actively working, whereas an unlocked door at this hour could be attributed to someone who'd stepped out and returned without badging in. Small things. The kind of small things that bought minutes. The person who came in was Marcus Teal. He was in uniform, which was wrong for the hour, and his face was carrying something she hadn't seen on it before. Not the belligerence of the cafeteria, not the tentative restraint of yesterday's visit. Something harder. Something that looked, underneath its controlled surface, genuinely alarmed. There's a meeting, he said. Vec called it. 40 minutes ago. Administrative staff, key personnel, and he stopped. You. She kept her voice flat. When? It's happening now. Or it was. I think they're waiting. He looked at her. Voss, there's a military police officer standing outside the administrative conference room. Not standing the way they stand when they're just present. Standing the way they stand when they're there for something specific. She processed that. MP at an internal administrative meeting at 230 called on 40 minutes notice. Who else was called? Forsett, Ashby, Sutter, Oakes. He paused on the last name and she watched his face for any sign that the name meant something specific to him. It didn't seem to, and you. Did they give a reason? Vec said it was a critical facility security matter. That's the language he used. He looked at the dark office around him, at the desk, the cabinets, the deliberate blankness of a space she'd already stripped of anything important. What do you have here that they want? Nothing, she said. Not anymore. His face worked through something. Is this... He stopped, and she could see him deciding how to phrase it. Is this as serious as I think it is? It's serious enough that you should not be in this room right now, she said. She stood up. Go back to wherever you came from and be visibly somewhere else in the next 10 minutes. And you? She thought about the supply convoy leaving at 400. She thought about the envelope with Priya. She thought about the 90 minutes between now and then and what she needed to do with them. I'm going to go to the meeting, she said. He stared at her. Voss, if I don't show, it gives them what they want, a documented failure to comply with a direct request, which is grounds for an emergency transfer and confiscation of my materials before I can object. She moved toward the door. I go in with nothing on me. I give them nothing to find. I stay until I know what they actually have. She looked at him. Go, he went. Not without a look back, but he went. The administrative conference room at 245 was lit with the particular harshness of overhead fluorescence and populated with people who looked like they'd been pulled from sleep and given 30 minutes to compose themselves. Forsett was there, visibly uncomfortable, nursing a coffee with both hands. Sutter was in uniform, tightly put together in a way that suggested he'd been awake before the call. Ashby was at the far end of the table, perfectly composed, which told her everything about who'd known in advance. Lieutenant Tara Oakes was seated beside Ashby, and this was the first time Serena had been in the same room with her since she'd identified the credential connection. Oakes was looking at the table. She didn't look up when Serena came in. Colonel Raymond Vex stood at the head of the table. He was 54, with the kind of physical authority that came from 20-plus years of being the largest presence in any room he entered. He had gray at his temples and a jaw that looked like it had been designed to convey resolve. He was looking at Serena with an expression she recognized as deliberate neutrality, the expressions of someone who has already decided the outcome of a conversation and is performing the process of arriving at it. Nurse Voss, he said, thank you for coming. She sat down. Of course, sir. We've called this meeting because of a serious concern about facility security. He opened a folder in front of him. Specifically, we have reason to believe that sensitive internal documentation has been accessed and potentially transmitted outside the facility without authorization. She kept her hands still on the table. I'm sorry to hear that. Our preliminary investigation indicates that the access originated from the supply and pharmacy administrative systems. He looked at her directly. Fall within your area of responsibility. They do, she said, along with 6 other staff members who have standard access to those systems. Those staff members have been cleared. Ashby said it from the end of the table without looking up from his notes. Clean, pre-prepared. They'd been building this for at least 24 hours. Cleared how, she asked. Through a review of their access patterns and documented activities, Vec said. The anomalous patterns belong to your credential profile. She looked at the folder in front of him. She wanted to see what was in it. Tell from the thickness that it wasn't thin they'd spent time on this, which meant either they had genuinely constructed a file around her activity, or they had fabricated one, and the difference mattered because one was harder to challenge than the other. I'd like to see the specific access records you're referencing, she said, in due time. Vec laced his hands on the table. Right now, I'd like to give you the opportunity to explain your recent activities. For our system access, the use of the pharmacy director's terminal, the requests for historical archive records outside your standard duty scope. Every one of those things was real. Every one of them had a legitimate explanation within her actual role. Every one of them could also be made to look like something else if the person framing them already controlled the narrative. My role includes inventory reconciliation, she said. I've been documenting a pattern of supply discrepancies, filed formal flags through the appropriate channels. The after-hours access was related to that documentation work. The use of Director Forset's terminal was authorized under my standing pharmacy cross-check authorization. She looked at Forset, who was looking at the table. The archive requests were to obtain historical records necessary for accurate timeline reconciliation. And the communication you made at 22 this morning, Ashby said, to a non-facility number using a personal device? She held his gaze. Personal communications are not subject to facility monitoring. When they involve potential transmission of classified operational data, they are. He set a paper on the table. Printout. A form. She could read the header from where she sat. Emergency Administrative Hold Personnel and Materials. There it was. This is premature, she said, keeping her voice level. Formal hold requires documented evidence of a specific violation. Evidence is being compiled, Vec said. In the interim, you're being asked to surrender any facility-related materials in your possession and to confine yourself to residential quarters pending review. She looked at him, looked at Ashby, looked at Oakes, who was still looking at the table and had said nothing this entire meeting, and whose shoulders were in the posture of someone actively working to disappear. I'd like to speak with legal counsel before complying, Serena said. You're not being charged with anything, Vec said. You're asking me to surrender materials and restrict my movement, she said. I'd like to speak with legal counsel. The room was quiet. Vec looked at her with an expression that was no longer performing neutrality. You are in a military facility, Nurse Voss, and you are subject to... The door opened. Not a knock. The door simply opened, and the MP who'd been standing outside stepped halfway in, and behind him were 2 people Serena had never seen at Harlow Peak. One was a woman in a suit, not military dress, civilian suit, mid-40s, carrying a tablet and the expression of someone who found the decor of this room unimpressive. The other was a man in Army officer's uniform, full colonel rank, with a branch insignia on his lapel that indicated the Army Inspector General's office. The room stopped. The woman in the suit walked to the head of the table without waiting for anyone to move. Colonel Vec, she said, I'm Special Agent Dana Croft, Defense Criminal Investigative Service. We've been in contact with your facility's regional command, and we have authorization to take custody of all supply management records, administrative access logs, and personnel files for the period covering the last 18 months. She set the tablet on the table. The authorization document was visible on the screen. We'll need the room, sir. Vec stared at her. This is highly Irregular. Yes. Croft looked at him with the specific patience of someone who has delivered this exact line to exactly this type of person before. The authorization is current as of tonight. We can discuss the irregularity after we've secured the materials. She looked around the table. If everyone except Colonel Veck and Lieutenant Colonel Ashby would step out, please. People moved. Forsett stood too fast and nearly knocked her coffee over. Sutter collected his folder and went without looking at anyone. Oakes stood and for the first time looked up, and her eyes found Serena's across the table, and what was in them was not defiance or anger. It was something closer to exhaustion. The look of someone who had been doing a thing they understood was wrong for long enough that the weight of it had hollowed something out. Serena walked into the corridor. The IG officer fell into step beside her. Didn't speak until they were 20 feet from the door. Voss, yes, the package arrived, he said it simply. Convoy driver handed it to our contact in Duskfield at 351. We had it confirmed by 410. He glanced at her. Good timing. She didn't answer. We need you to be available for a full debrief. Tonight, once Croft has the room secured, is there anything inside this facility that wasn't in the package? She thought for a moment. The physical dummy folder in my office. Bottom cabinet, second drawer. Nothing useful in it, but it's evidence of the search it was moved. He nodded. We'll collect it. She leaned against the corridor wall and let out one slow breath. Not relief, it was too early for relief, and she knew better than to feel it, but something adjacent. The recognition that the worst possible moment had arrived, and she was still standing in it. The next 4 hours were the strangest Serena had spent at Harlow Peak, which was a high bar. CIS agents worked through the facility in pairs, quiet and methodical. The administrative wing was locked off. Veck and Ashby remained in the conference room, now with a legal officer present from the IG's office and nobody emerging to explain anything to the staff, beginning to populate the corridors as the 600 shift started. Priya found her in the break room at 530, with 2 cups of bad coffee and the looks of someone who had slept exactly 0 hours but was running on something more sustainable than adrenaline. Yemi's brother-in-law came through, she said, setting a cup in front of Serena. I know. Thank him. Serena wrapped her hands around the cup. How are you? I'm fine. Priya sat down, weird. I'm fine and weird. That's the appropriate response. They sat for a moment in the particular quiet of a situation that hadn't resolved yet, where the wheels had been set in motion, but the full weight of what they'd set in motion hadn't landed. Oakes, Priya said in the meeting. She looked tired, Serena said. Yeah. Priya looked at her coffee. Not evil, just tired. People doing things they shouldn't are usually more tired than evil, Serena said. Not an excuse. It's just what it looks like. At 615, the facility's PA system crackled an unusual occurrence at any hour and announced that the morning briefings were postponed pending administrative review. Collective murmur ran through the corridors. Soldiers who'd been heading to the briefing room detoured to common areas and started doing what soldiers do in uncertainty, speculating at volume, with increasing creative elaboration. Marcus Teal found Serena at 640. He came into the break room and looked at her with the expression of someone who had spent the last 4 hours in a state of sustained, silent alarm and was only now beginning to process that it might resolve differently than he'd feared. There are federal investigators in the administrative wing, he said. I know. He sat down across from her. He looked at his hands, then at her. How long have you been working on this? She considered how much to say. Before I arrived. He absorbed that, worked through it visibly. Transfer request. The supply role. His voice was carefully even. You came here for this. She didn't confirm or deny it. She held her coffee cup. The cafeteria, he said. Yes, you knew I was. He stopped. You knew I was being used. I knew you were being pointed in a direction, she said. Whether you were being used or just given permission to do what you already wanted do, I wasn't sure. That landed. She watched him take it without flinching, which was something she hadn't been sure he was capable of 6 weeks ago. I should have started. You did what you did, she said. Not unkindly. And then you came to my office and offered to help, and then you went and got out of the way when I told you to. Counts. She paused. Not for everything, but it counts for something. He nodded. He sat in that for a while. At 720, Dana Croft's assistant came to find Serena for the debrief. She stood, picked up her cold coffee, and started to follow. At the door she stopped. Teal. He looked up. When this settles, she said, However it settles, the soldiers here need to know what their supplies were being used for. Not as a rumor. Properly. Through someone they'll actually listen to. She looked at him steadily. Probably be you. He held her gaze, and what moved across his face was something she'd never seen on it before. Something that looked, underneath its discomfort, like the beginnings of accountability rather than just regret. She walked out. The debrief took 3 hours and covered ground she'd already documented, which was the point. Croft was checking the story against the materials, looking for inconsistencies and identifying gaps that needed additional investigation. Serena answered every question straight and kept nothing back. She was past the point where anything she said could make her more exposed than she already was. The end? Croft set down her tablet and looked across the table. The ghost credential trace is solid, she said. The VEC authorization is solid. Ashby's interference pattern is documented well enough to survive a challenge. She paused. Oakes came in voluntarily an hour ago. Serena kept her expression neutral. Okay. She's providing a full account. She's naming additional personnel at 2 external sites who are receiving the redirected supplies. Croft studied her. You expected that. I thought there was a reasonable chance, Serena said. She looked like someone who'd wanted to stop for a while and hadn't been able to. Croft looked at her for a moment. We're going to need you to remain available and on site for the next 48 hours minimum. After that, we'll talk about next steps. Understood. She left the debrief room, walked down the administrative corridor toward the supply wing. The hall was quiet in the specific way that a place goes quiet after a significant disruption, not empty, but subdued. People moving with their heads down and their voices low. She was passing the corridor junction near the main entrance when she heard it. Distant at first, then closer vehicles. Multiple. Moving fast. Then the radio on an MP's belt 2 feet away crackled into life and a voice said, sharp and clipped, medical team to the main entrance. We have incoming 3 critical trauma and blast. Special operations extraction convoy, diverted from Fort Birch. Multiple personnel with severe injuries. ETA 4 minutes. The MP was already moving. Serena stopped in the corridor. The facility's trauma capacity was limited. She knew from the inventory, she knew better than anyone at this point what they had in stock and what they didn't. The missing supplies hadn't just been an accounting problem. Trauma medications, surgical kits, specific components that a supply room should have in quantity, and that had been systematically drained for 16 months. She knew exactly what would be missing when they opened those cabinets. She was already running. She hit the supply room at a dead sprint, pulled the emergency override on the main cabinet, and did in 40 seconds what should have taken 4 minutes, a full trauma kit assessment from physical inspection, not system records, because the system records were compromised and she wasn't touching them. She pulled what was there, identified the critical gaps with the speed of someone who had done this under conditions considerably worse than a lit supply room in Montana, and was already calculating substitutions when Priya appeared in the doorway, breathless. They're here, Priya said. 3 patients. One's in full arrest. Serena grabbed 2 supply bags and moved. What's the surgical team? Forsett is the senior clinician. She hasn't done trauma in a while. Who else? Dr. Ellis Marin. He's good, but he's never done a field blast injury. He'll be fine. She was already in the corridor, moving fast. Who's on anesthesia? Sandoval, but she's dealing with the second patient. Serena pushed through the door into the trauma bay, and the room hit her like a physical thing. 4 people already working, a gurney coming through from the entrance. Blood, motion. Specific controlled noise of a medical emergency that is not yet under control. The soldier on the gurney was young, 22, maybe 23, and he had a blast injury to the lower left chest that compromised the thoracic cavity in a way she could assess from 10 feet away. Marin was at the head of the gurney looking at the injury with the expression of someone who knows what they're seeing and is performing the calculations of whether they can do what the situation requires. He looked up when she came in. I need a chest decompression, he said. Now, I know. She was already at the supply bag, pulling what she needed. I've got it. He looked at her. She looked back at him with the expression of someone who has done this before, not in a simulation, not in a training environment, but in conditions where the alternative to doing it correctly was a body bag, and something in that expression crossed the room faster than words would have. Tell me what you need, he said. She was already gloved. What I need, she said, is for you to trust me for the next 6 minutes. The room went focused. The noise narrowed. and Serena Voss, who had arrived at Harlow Peak as a paperwork nurse, worked with the speed and precision of someone for whom this was not new and not frightening and not a performance. It was simply what she did. The soldier's oxygen saturation, which had been falling, stabilized at the 4-minute mark. Nobody in that trauma bay said a word about supply nurses or civilian contractors. But 3 people made eye contact with each other across the gurney, and the look that passed between them was the kind that doesn't need language. The look that says, "Who is this person? And why didn't anyone tell us?" Outside the trauma bay, through the small window in the door, Marcus Teal stood in the corridor. He had come to find Serena for something minor, a question about the debrief, something he could have sent a message about, and instead, he stood watching through the glass as she worked over a wounded soldier, with the hands of someone who had done this 100 times in places that didn't make it onto any map he'd been given access to. He stood there until it was over. Then he went to find Dana Croft. He had something to add to his statement, something he should have said differently, and something entirely new because he was beginning to understand, with the particular shame of a man who had been badly wrong about something he'd been certain of, exactly what he'd been used to attack, and exactly why, and who had been using him. He found Croft in the administrative corridor. She looked up when he approached. "I need to talk to you," he said. "I figured you would," she said. "Come in." He followed her into the room, and the door closed behind him, and he began, for the first time, to say out loud everything he'd been part of, without knowing it, every interaction, every conversation, every casual comment from Ashby or Sutter that had been designed to point him at Serena Voss like a weapon and keep him looking in the wrong direction. He talked for 40 minutes. When he finished, Croft set down her tablet and looked at him with an expression that was not warm, but was not unkind. "Is there anything else?" He thought for a moment. "One thing," he said. "When this is done, when you have everything you need, I want it on record that she did everything right, every part of it." He paused, because from where I was standing, nobody was making it easy. Croft looked at him for a moment. "It's already on record," she said. "Been on record since the package arrived at 351. He walked out of the room. In the trauma bay, Serena was finishing the documentation on the 3rd patient stable now, which was not the outcome that had seemed likely 40 minutes ago. And she was writing with the specific focused calm of someone running on very little sleep and a great deal of controlled purpose. And she did not yet know what Marcus Teal had just said, or that Raymond Veck had been formally detained 40 minutes earlier, or that Gordon Ashby had stopped cooperating with investigators and asked for a lawyer. She would know soon. But in this moment she was writing, and the patient was breathing, and the room was quiet. And somewhere in the facility, too, DCIS agents were walking toward an office, where the last piece of physical evidence she hadn't been able to get off-site was sitting in a filing cabinet in a manila envelope, still sealed. The evidence that didn't just prove the supply theft. The evidence that showed where the stolen supplies had been going, who had been receiving them, under what arrangements, and what they had been paying, and the name at the top of that payment chain was not Raymond Veck's. It was someone above him. Someone whose name had not appeared anywhere in Serena's documented findings. Someone who, at this exact moment, was making a phone call from outside the facility. The phone call lasted 4 minutes and 32 seconds. The person making it was Brigadier General Harold Steck, and he was making it from the parking lot of a restaurant 11 miles outside Duskfield, Montana, where he had been having dinner with 2 civilian contractors when his secure phone had buzzed 3 times in quick succession, the signal he'd set up with Veck 8 months ago, to mean problem. Call immediately. Veck hadn't called. The signal had come from Ashby's number, which meant Veck was already unavailable, which meant the problem was past the stage of problems that Veck could handle. Steck was 61 years old, with 34 years of service, and the kind of institutional authority that accumulates, so gradually it becomes invisible to others, and eventually to the person carrying it. He had been careful. He had been so careful for so long that he had made the mistake that careful people make when they've gone undetected long enough. He had started to believe the caution was permanent, that the structure he'd built was as solid as it felt from the inside. He made the 4-minute call to a number in Colorado, told the person on the other end to begin the process they'd discussed as a contingency. Then he went back inside, finished his drink, paid the bill, and drove to Harlow Peak in the specific calm of a man who has decided that the appearance of normalcy is the only remaining asset he has. He arrived at 931 and walked into the administrative wing with his rank, doing what rank does, parting the uncertainty of junior staff, generating the automatic deference of people who assume that if someone with stars on his collar is moving with purpose, the purpose is legitimate. He made it as far as the junction outside the conference room. Dana Croft was standing in the corridor, not waiting, just present, in the way of someone who had known, approximately, when he would arrive. "General Steck," she said, "thank you for coming in." He looked at her badge, at the IG officer beside her. The second DCIS agent 10 feet behind her, who was not making any effort to look casual. He looked at all of this, and did the calculation that a man with 34 years of service does very quickly. How much do they have? And is there anything left to protect? "I'm here to assess the situation," he said. "Of course." Croft gestured toward the conference room. "We'd like to speak with you." He went in. Because the alternative was to not go in, and that would tell them everything they needed to know in under 5 seconds. Serena didn't know Steck was in the building for another hour. She spent that hour in the trauma bay's anteroom, writing up her intervention documentation with the methodical thoroughness of someone who understands that what gets written down is what survived. The 3 special operations soldiers were stable. The one she'd treated directly, Private First Class Dion Tapper, 22 years old, blast injury to the thoracic cavity, was in recovery with full respiratory function restored. Marin had told her, in the abbreviated language of people who've just worked through something intense together, that without the immediate decompression, Tapper would have arrested before they got him stabilized. She wrote that down too, not because she needed the credit, because it was accurate, and accuracy was the only thing she'd ever really been working toward. Priya came in at 1007 and sat in the chair across from her without speaking for a moment. She looked like someone who had reached the far side of an experience and was still orienting. "They detained Vec," she said finally. "I know. And Ashby." "Yes." "And Oakes voluntarily surrendered." Priya looked at the wall. "She's apparently been talking for hours." Serena set down her pen. "Good. Is it?" Priya's voice wasn't challenging, it was genuinely uncertain. She helped them steal from injured soldiers, from people who needed those supplies. "Yes," Serena said. And she also stopped, eventually, by walking into that room and telling the truth. Both of those things happened. She picked the pen back up. First one is why she'll face consequences. The second one is why those consequences might be proportionate. Priya chewed the inside of her cheek. "I keep thinking about what it would have taken for her to have said something sooner. Probably more courage than she had at the time," Serena said. "Which is true of most people." They sat in that for a moment. "What happens now?" Priya asked. "Now the investigators do their work," Serena said, "and the rest of us wait to find out how far it goes." She didn't say anything about Steck, not because she was keeping it from Priya, but because she didn't know yet. The sealed envelope, the one with the payment chain, the one that showed money moving from an external source to accounts that didn't belong to Vec, that envelope was in DCIS custody. What was in it would determine what happened next, and she hadn't been read into the investigators' findings. She'd handed over the evidence and stepped back, because that was the line between her role and theirs, and she knew better than to cross it. But she'd seen that payment chain. She'd built it herself from fragments and cross-references over 3 nights in a supply office with the desk lamp on low. She knew what was in it. She knew there was a name at the top that wasn't on any internal Harlow Peak roster. She just hadn't been able to confirm the rank. At 1043, the IG officer, Colonel James Whitford, came to find her. He was a compact man in his early 50s, unhurried, in the way of someone who had seen enough institutional disasters to have stopped being surprised by them. And he sat down across from her in the anteroom with a cup of coffee he'd clearly been carrying for a while and hadn't drunk much of. "Sealed envelope," he said. "The payment chain you documented." "Yes." "Walk me through how you built it." She walked him through it. Every step, the ghost credential extraction logs that showed not just what was being taken, but where the requisition codes were being routed, the external vendor account numbers that appeared in the routing data, public financial disclosure records she'd cross-referenced from the facilities network on her second week before her access was downgraded, and the account name, not a person's name, a shell company name, Caldwell Meridian Solutions, that appeared in connection with a procurement contract at another military medical facility in a completely different state. She'd found it because she'd looked at what the stolen supplies were worth on the open market, then looked at legitimate military procurement contracts in comparable supply categories, and the numbers at Caldwell Meridian had been specifically close to the kind of close that isn't coincidental. Whitford listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Caldwell Meridian Solutions, he said. Yes. That name has appeared in 2 other investigations in the last 3 years. Neither of them reached the level of prosecution. She looked at him. Why not? He held her gaze. Because the connection to the contracting officer who approved the procurement never solidified sufficiently for charges. The officer in question had a strong institutional position and excellent legal representation, and the evidence in both cases was circumstantial enough that it didn't survive challenge. She understood what he wasn't saying. But the payment chain I documented is different. Different, he said, because you traced it from the inside. Previous investigations were working from external financial records backward. You built it from supply extraction logs forward. The chain of custody is clean. The documentation is time-stamped, and it corroborates independently. He set his coffee down. General Steck is in that conference room right now. The room was very quiet. He arrived voluntarily, Whitford continued. Whether that remains the characterization of his presence depends on what happens in the next hour. She absorbed that. The contracting officer in the previous 2 investigations, she said. Steck. He approved both contracts. Whitford met her eyes. We couldn't prove he benefited. Until now. She looked at her documentation on the table in front of her. Patient write-up, the intervention record, all the normal-looking paperwork of a nurse who had been doing her job. She thought about the morning in the cafeteria, and a bowl clattering across a linoleum floor, and about 6 weeks of being pointed at like a problem, rather than a person, and about the small supply office, with the concrete wall window, and the blank coffee mug, and the encrypted drive that had spent 5 weeks in her jacket pocket. What do you need from me? She said. Availability, Whitford said. When Croft presents the payment chain to Steck's legal counsel, they'll challenge the methodology. You'll need to be able to explain your documentation process in formal testimony. Can do that. In detail, under cross-examination, from investigators and attorneys who will be specifically trying to find inconsistencies. I know what testimony involves, she said. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that sat between assessment and something that might, at a stretch, have been respect. Yes, he said. I expect you do. He stood and picked up his untouched coffee. Stay available, he said. This moves quickly now. It moved quickly. At 1130, Harlow Peak's acting duty officer, a major drafted into the role by circumstance, sent a facility-wide notice that all non-essential personnel were to remain in their designated areas until further notice. The language was deliberately vague. The effect was that 200 soldiers and medical staff were confined to a space with no clear explanation and the particular rumor ecosystem that develops when the people in charge of communication have stopped communicating. Marcus Teal, to his credit, did something useful. He moved through the common areas and the residential corridors with the steady authority of a man who has spent 11 years being the person other soldiers look to when things feel unstable, and he said, every cluster of confused and speculating people he encountered, a version of the same thing. I know it looks bad. I don't have the full picture yet. But I can tell you this isn't a threat to the people in this facility. Give the investigators room to work. It didn't stop the speculation. Nothing stopped speculation. But it lowered the temperature, and that mattered. Stopped by the anteroom at 1215. Serena was still there, working through documentation, because there was always more to write. And writing was how she kept herself functional when waiting was the only other option. He stood in the doorway. He had the look of a man who had been sitting with something for several hours and had worked through it but not past it. The soldiers, he said. The ones from the convoy. Are they stable, she said, all 3. He nodded. He looked at the floor. The one you worked on. He's in recovery. I heard what Marin said. He looked up. About what you did. She waited. I've been an infantry sergeant for 11 years, he said. I've seen field medics work. Good ones. He stopped. What you did in there, that's not supply nurse work. No, she said, it isn't. He held her gaze. Why did you let me? He stopped again, started over. You knew I was being used. You knew Ashby was pointing me at you. And you let me keep doing it. For weeks. I needed the operation to keep looking like what they thought it was. she said. Your behavior was actually useful. If you'd suddenly started treating me differently, it would have flagged something. Stared at her. You used my being an ass to you. I used the situation, she said, which included your behavior. Yes, he absorbed that. Something moved through his expression, complicated, not resolved. Don't know whether to be impressed or deeply uncomfortable. Both seems appropriate, she said. He almost laughed. It came out as something shorter, something that crossed his face briefly, and then settled into the more complicated expression underneath. I'm sorry, he said. For the cafeteria. For all of it. I know you're not. I know that kind of apology is cheap at this point. It's not nothing, she said. It's just not the most important thing right now. He nodded once. Started to go then, the soldiers. The ones who watched that morning in the cafeteria. He turned back. When this is over, whatever you'll let me say to them, I want to say it. She looked at him. Say what's true, she said. That's all anyone needs to hear. Conference room door opened at 1340. Croft came out first, followed by Whitford, and the expression on both of their faces was the specific contained neutrality of investigators who have reached a significant moment and are not yet permitted to show it. Behind them came Steck's military legal counsel, a colonel in JAG uniform, moving fast and already on his phone. Steck himself came out last. He walked into the corridor and for a moment stood with his hands at his sides and looked at the facility around him, the fluorescent lights, the linoleum, concrete block walls, with the expression of someone who is seeing a place clearly for the first time, because they know they won't be seeing it again. He was not in handcuffs. That would come later. And through process, which was slower and more procedurally correct, and ultimately more final than anything that happened in a corridor. But the look on his face was the look of a man who knows the difference between the moment a thing ends and the paperwork that follows. Captain Sutter came out of a side office at that moment, with a folder under his arm, not paying attention, and walked directly into Steck's line of sight. He stopped, looked at Steck, looked at Croft, did the arithmetic of the situation in approximately 2 seconds, and the color left his face in a way that answered several questions Serena had kept in a secondary column of her mental notes, questions about how many people at the operational level had known. Croft noticed. Captain Sutter, she said. Stay available. We'll need to speak with you this afternoon. Sutter said nothing. He stood in the corridor holding his folder, and the folder shook slightly, which was the only visible thing. Serena watched from the junction at the end of the corridor. She had come out of the anteroom when she heard the door open, not because she'd been waiting to watch, but because Whitford had asked her to be accessible. And this was a narrow building. She stood at a distance that was professionally appropriate, and she watched Steck move through the corridor toward the facility exit, flanked by 2 DCIS agents who were maintaining the specific proximity that is not yet custody, but is also not suggestion. He glanced at her once. She didn't look away. She didn't perform anything, no satisfaction, no anger, nothing demonstrative. She just held his gaze with the same steadiness she'd brought to every other moment in this building, and he looked away first. Out the door, 30 seconds later. The next 6 hours were documentation and logistics, and the particular bureaucratic aftermath of a significant institutional failure, which is somehow both more and less dramatic than the event itself. DCIS agents moved through the supply room with systematic precision, collecting physical records that cross-referenced against Serena's digital documentation. The pharmaceutical logs were pulled entirely and sent for independent forensic audit. The external vendor database was locked down pending a review of every procurement contract Caldwell Meridian Solutions had touched, which turned out to span 4 states and 18 months more than Harlow Peak's timeline. Vec was formally charged at 1,515. The charges read out in the administrative record were conspiracy to commit fraud, misappropriation of government property, obstruction of an official investigation, and conduct unbecoming. His face in the documentation photo, which Whitford showed Serena as part of her briefing, was the face of a man who had spent 20 years being certain of his own architecture and had arrived at the moment when architecture turns out to be furniture. Ashby's charges came through at 1,630 with the additional count of unauthorized interference with an assigned investigator, a charge that required Whitford to confirm, for the record, that Serena had been operating in an official investigative capacity since before her arrival at Harlow Peak. That confirmation, when it appeared in the facility's administrative record, had an effect. Not immediately visible, not dramatic, But Serena could feel it moving through the building, the way temperature changes move through a space, before anyone consciously registers them. People who had treated her as background noise began finding reasons to walk past the supply wing. Two medics who had never spoken to her stopped in the corridor to ask about the soldiers from the convoy. A junior supply officer named Carver Young, 24, had been working under Sutter and clearly hadn't known what he was working adjacent to, came to her office door at 1700 and stood there, looking like someone who needed to say something, and wasn't sure it was welcome. "I just wanted to," he started. "You're fine," she said, without looking up from the form she was completing. "Whatever you're worried about having been part of, you're fine." He let out a breath. "How did you know that's what I was going to say?" "Because you've been walking past this door for 40 minutes, she said. "Come in or don't, but you don't have to stand in the hallway." He came in, sat down in the chair across from her desk that had held a series of very different conversations over the past weeks. "Processed some of the requisitions," he said. "The ones that went through Oaks. I didn't know they were. I mean, they looked standard. Flag anything that looked non-standard. Once, 4 months ago, a quantity seemed high. I asked Sutter, and he told me it was a pre-deployment stockpile order." She looked up. "Write that down," she said. "Date, what you flagged," what Sutter said, to Agent Croft's assistant. "It corroborates the interference pattern." He blinked. "Will I be—" "You flagged an anomaly and were given a false explanation by a superior officer," she said. "That's not complicity. That's documentation." She held his gaze. "Write it down." He nodded. Left. Came back 12 minutes later with a handwritten page that he slid through the door without knocking, then disappeared. She added it to the pile. At 1845, Priya brought food, 2 plastic-wrapped sandwiches from the facility canteen, and 2 bottles of water, and sat in the chair that had hosted Teal, Ashby, Marin, and now a junior supply officer in the span of a single extraordinary day. She set the food on the corner of the desk and didn't pretend that it was a normal evening. "Steck," she said. "That's the general, right?" Serena unwrapped one of the sandwiches. "Yes." "When did you know it went that high?" "I suspected at the 3-week mark," she said. "Confirmed it in the last 72 hours. She took a bite. It was bad. The bread had the texture of something that had been sitting since morning, but she was hungry enough not to care. Payment chain goes through Caldwell Meridian to a set of accounts connected to contracts Steck personally approved. It's not proof of personal financial benefit on its own, but it's enough to open the financial records, and when you open those, you find the money." "You find the money," Serena confirmed. Priya was quiet for a moment. "How many people at other facilities?" She stopped. "Did any soldiers die because of missing supplies? Because of what was being stolen?" Question sat in the room. Serena set down her sandwich. "I don't know," she said. "I don't have data on outcomes at facilities where redirected supplies may have been used as replacements. That's what the broader audit will look at." She paused. "It's one of the reasons I needed this to go through proper channels and not just stop at Harlow Peak." Priya absorbed that. Her face went through something that didn't resolve into anything simple. Finally, "I'm fine," Priya said. "I'm asking because it matters, not because I can't handle the answer." She picked up her water bottle. "When do you have to testify?" "Formal proceedings will take months to schedule," Serena said. "But the deposition process starts in a few weeks. And until then you're here?" "Until then I'm here." Priya nodded. She ate half her sandwich, and they sat in a quiet that felt, for the first time since Serena had arrived at Harlow Peak, like something sustainable rather than something being maintained under pressure. At 2012, Serena's phone buzzed. Not the replace SIM, she hadn't put that back. Pure channel she'd been given for this posting. A message from Whitford. "Steck's counsel has received the financial documentation. We expect a cooperation conversation by morning. Your testimony timeline will be confirmed by 1000 tomorrow." Twice. Set the phone down, looked at the wall. Thought about the word cooperation and what it meant when it came from the legal representative of a brigadier general who had 34 years of institutional relationships and a very clear understanding of what cooperation could get him, and about what that cooperation would likely involve: names, arrangements, the full architecture of something that had been running long enough that it had other nodes, other facilities, other people who had made the same calculation Vec had made and thought the same thing. Steck had thought that careful was the same as safe, and that safe was the same as permanent. It wasn't any of those things. But the fact that Steck was moving toward cooperation also meant he was moving toward self-preservation. And self-preservation at that level, with that much to offer, sometimes bought things it shouldn't. She picked up her phone again and typed back to Whitford. Understood. One question: does cooperation affect the Harlow Peak charges, or only the extended network investigation? His response came in 4 minutes, to be determined. Croft is managing the parameters. Your documentation stands independent of any cooperation deal. It cannot be suppressed or modified as part of any agreement. She read that 3 times, set the phone down, looked at the supply room door, which someone had left open, through which she could see the shelves she'd organized. In her first week, the cabinets, the labeled sections, physical inventory that represented what this facility was supposed to have and had been systematically bled for 16 months. She thought, good. Then she thought of something else. The warning message. They know you called. 3 words from an unknown number sent at the exact right moment to give her the window she'd needed. Traced it as far as she could through the number relay and hit a wall. Not an unusual wall burner. Relays were common, but the timing had been too precise. Whoever sent it had known not just that the call had been monitored, but when the monitoring had triggered a response. That was insider knowledge. Not the kind Vec had, or Ashby. They would have simply moved on her immediately rather than sending a warning to the person they were trying to stop. It was the kind of knowledge someone had if they were inside the monitoring, but against the people running it. She opened the message thread on her secure channel, looked at the unknown number that had sent the warning, copied it, sent it to Whitford with a single line. Do you know this number? His response came back in 7 minutes, which was longer than his previous ones. Yes. Then after a pause of 30 seconds, it belongs to Lieutenant Tara Oakes. Serena sat very still. Oakes had sent the warning. Oakes, who had created the ghost credential and run the logistics side, and sat in that 245 meeting looking at the table. Oakes had sent her a message in the middle of the night that had given her the time she needed to get the evidence out of the building. Oakes had been inside the operation and had been trying to find a way out of it for long enough that when the moment came, she'd taken the one action available to her that didn't require her to expose herself directly. She'd warned the person who was already doing the work. Serena thought about what Priya had said. She didn't look evil, just tired. She typed one more message to Whitford. Make sure Croft knows that detail when she's discussing Oakes's cooperation parameters. Then she put the phone in her pocket, stood up, and turned off the desk lamp. Supply room was dark. The corridor was quiet. Outside, the Montana night was doing what Montana nights do in November, pushing cold through every gap in the building's concrete and making the windows run with condensation. Tomorrow there would be formal proceedings, depositions, legal processes that would take months and require her to sit in rooms with attorneys and investigators and explain, in precise language under oath, exactly what she had done and why and how. But tonight, standing in the dark supply office with the concrete wall window and the blank coffee mug and the shelves she'd rebuilt from the ground up, Serena Voss allowed herself one thing she'd been careful not to do for the entire 6 weeks she'd been at Harlow Peak. She stopped working, just for a moment, stood in the dark and breathed, and then her phone buzzed one more time. Not Whitford, Croft, not the secure channel. The personal number, the one she'd been using before she pulled the SIM, the number she'd reassembled an hour ago because she needed it functional for the next day's communications. The message was from a number she didn't recognize, different from the Oakes relay. Clean, no routing markers, no prepaid signature. Kind of number that belonged to a government-issued device on a secure line. 4 words, we need to talk. And below it, a name that made her go completely still, because it was a name she hadn't heard in 3 years, attached to a rank she hadn't known that person had reached, belonging to someone who should not have had any connection to Harlow Peak or Caldwell Meridian or Harold Steck. Someone who, if they were involved, meant this wasn't the end of anything. It meant she had been a thread being pulled from an edge, and whatever was at the center of it was still intact, still running, still waiting to find out who else was going to come looking. She read the name 3 times, not because she didn't recognize it, because she needed the 3 seconds that reading it repeatedly gave her 3 seconds to bring her breathing down, to clear the reaction from her face before it could settle into anything visible, to do the thing she'd spent years training her when information arrived that changed the shape of everything she thought she understood. The name was Colonel Diane Morrow. 3 years ago, Diane Morrow had been a lieutenant colonel and the commanding officer of the forward operating base in Afghanistan, where Serena had served her last combat medic deployment. She'd been rigorous and demanding and occasionally brilliant, and she had also been the person who, in the final week of Serena's deployment, had signed the orders that sent a 3-person medical team into a sector they'd specifically flagged as unstable orders that had resulted in 2 casualties, one of which had been a medic named Rosario Venn, who was 24 years old and 3 months from going home. Morrow had been cleared of wrongdoing. The inquiry had found the orders were within operational parameters. Serena had submitted her own statement, factual, precise, everything she remembered, and the statement had been received and filed and had changed nothing. She'd requested her transfer to the investigative program 6 weeks after the inquiry closed. She had not spoken to Diane Morrow since. And now Morrow, who was apparently a full colonel, was texting her personal number at 2023 on the night that Harold Steck had been walked out of Harlow Peak Military Medical Center by DCIS agents, telling her they needed to talk. Serena stood in the dark supply room for a long moment. Then she typed back 2 words, "Call me." The phone rang in under a minute. The voice was the same. That was the first thing voices don't change the way faces do. They carry the same specific texture through years and distance, and Morrow's voice had always had a particular quality of precision, like someone who had decided at some point that every word was a resource and waste was unacceptable. "Voss," she said. "Colonel Morrow, you know why I'm calling." "I have a guess," Serena said. "I'd rather you tell me." Pause short, not hesitant. "Organizing. Steck approved a procurement contract for a base I was CO of 14 months ago. Caldwell Meridian Solutions. I flagged the pricing as anomalous at the time. Told by the regional contracting office that the review had cleared it." Another pause. "I should have pushed harder. I didn't." Serena was quiet. "I'm not calling to confess something," Morrow said. "I'm calling because my name appears in the Caldwell Meridian contracting records as the receiving CO. And when this becomes public, which it will, within days, I need the record to show that I raised the flag, that I wasn't part of it." "Was your flag documented?" "Yes. Internal email dated, I have the chain." "Then you need to forward that to Colonel Whitford at the IG's office," Serena said. "Tonight, not tomorrow. Forward it and follow up with a call at 700. "I know the process," Morrow said. The precision in her voice had an edge under it, now not anger, something more complicated. "I'm calling you because your name is on this investigation, and I wanted you to know before it lands." Serena held the phone and looked at the dark window and the condensation running down the glass. "Is that the only reason?" The silence was 4 seconds. "No," Morrow said. Another 2 seconds. "I've read your full file," Morrow said. "Employment record, the inquiry transcript, your statement." The precision was still there, but something had shifted underneath it, not softness. "Exactly. But the sound of a person saying something they've been deciding whether to say for a long time. Your statement was accurate. I've always known it was accurate. The orders were within parameters, but the parameters were wrong, and I knew the sector report, and I sent the team anyway, and Venn died." She paused. "That's true. The inquiry said what it said, and that's also true. Both of those things have been true for 3 years." Serena closed her eyes, opened them. "Yes," she said. "They have. I should have said that sooner." "You should have," Serena said. With anger. "Just the fact of it, I know." They were quiet for a moment. "Forward the documentation tonight," Serena said finally. "Whitford will make sure it's in the record properly. If you flagged the contract and it was overridden, that's relevant, and it'll be treated as relevant." "Thank you," Morrow said. Serena hung up. She stood in the dark for a while longer after that, longer than she'd planned, not falling apart. That wasn't something she did, and it wasn't something this moment required. But she let herself feel the weight of it for a minute, because it was real, and it deserved that. Rosario Venn had been 24 years old, and 3 months from going home. And the person who sent her into that sector had just said you were right 3 years after it mattered, prompted by self-interest as much as conscience. And those 2 things were both true simultaneously, and there was no clean way to hold them. She breathed. Then she picked up her phone, texted Whitford, "Expect documentation from Colonel Morrow tonight. Contracting records, Caldwell Meridian. Receive it." And walked out of the supply room and down the corridor and outside into the Montana cold, which hit her face the same way it had the first time, like the air had somewhere to be and had already been there. Stood outside for 5 minutes. Then she went to bed. The formal proceedings began on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the night Steck walked out of Harlow Peak's administrative corridor. The charging documents had been filed the week before Vec and Ashby first, then Steck, then, separately, and with a different charge profile that reflected her cooperation, Tara Oakes. Sutter had been charged with lesser counts of obstruction and knowing facilitation, which his attorney was already preparing to challenge. The Caldwell Meridian Network had been referred to a joint DCIS and DOJ task force, which had identified 4 additional military facilities with procurement contracts under review and 14 months of financial records to work through. Morrow's documentation had arrived at Whitford's office at 49 that night, which was 20 minutes after their call. The email chain was clean date-stamped, internally consistent, showing a flag raised and overridden by a contracting officer, now under federal investigation. Morrow was listed as a cooperating witness rather than a subject, which was accurate to the record and was also the outcome of having called Serena before the morning briefings rather than after. Serena's deposition took 2 days. She sat in a room with a court reporter and attorneys from the IG's office and the DOJ and gave the same precise account she'd been carrying for 6 weeks from the first anomaly she'd noticed on her second day at Harlow Peak to the ghost. Credential to the payment chain, to the sealed envelope on the 400 convoy. Every question they asked had an answer. Every answer was documented. Not because she was exceptional in some way that made this easy, but because she'd done the work every day for 6 weeks in a small office with a concrete wall window, choosing to write things down rather than relying on memory, choosing accuracy over speed, choosing to keep going when every social signal in the building was pointing at her like a problem. Cross-examination from Steck's defense counsel lasted 4 hours and found nothing inconsistent because there was nothing inconsistent to find. On the second day of the deposition, during a recess, Croft sat down across from her in the hallway outside the proceedings room with a coffee that she actually drank rather than carrying around as a prop. Steck's counsel came back this morning, Croft said. He's offering full cooperation on the extended network. Names, arrangements, the financial mechanism, everything. Serena looked at her. In exchange for? Reduction on 2 of the 5 counts. The financial fraud charge stays. The obstruction charge stays. Croft held her gaze. Cooperation deal doesn't affect your documentation standing or the Harlow Peak charges against Vec, Ashby, or Oakes. I know, Serena said. Whitford told me. I wanted to tell you myself. Croft paused. Because you should know that the decision isn't mine. To make it's the DOJ's. But my recommendation was that the deal only proceeds if the Harlow Peak charges are not reduced. People who stole from soldiers, who needed those supplies, don't get a softened outcome because the man above them decided to be useful. Serena was quiet for a moment. Did they take your recommendation? Mostly. Croft's expression didn't change. It's a negotiation. The outcome is better than it would have been without your documentation, and worse than a perfect world would produce. She picked up her coffee. Thought you should hear that from someone who wasn't going to frame it as a complete victory because it isn't. I know what it is, Serena said. I've been doing this long enough to know what it is. Croft nodded once, stood up. Your testimony is solid, she said. Whatever happens in the negotiation, what you built doesn't change. She walked back into the proceedings room. Serena sat in the hallway for another 3 minutes and thought about the gap between what justice looks like in a movie and what it looks like in a federal proceeding, and about how the gap doesn't make the proceeding worthless. It just makes it honest. Steck would cooperate, and it would matter, and it would not fix everything. And all of those things would be true at the same time. She went back in. The formal recognition happened 6 weeks after the deposition. On a Thursday afternoon in Harlow Peak's main briefing hall, a room designed to hold 200 people that was now holding closer to 300 because the story had moved through the base, the way stories move through closed communities, which is completely and with embellishment, and eventually stripped of embellishment with something like awe. Colonel Whitford presided. Dana Croft was present but seated, which felt right. She was there as a witness, not a principal. Martian was in the 3rd row. Yemi Adaraha was in the 5th, next to her brother-in-law, who had apparently been told enough of the story to feel that attending was appropriate and had worn his best civilian shirt. Carver, the junior supply officer who'd written his handwritten page and slid it under the door, was standing at the back because he'd come late and all the chairs were taken. Priya was in the front row. Marcus Teal was standing at the side of the room, in dress uniform, not because he'd been asked to present anything, but because he'd decided that if he was going to be present for this, he was going to be properly present, which Serena, she saw him from the doorway, thought was the most accurate thing he'd done since she'd arrived. Whitford read the formal commendation into the record, covered the operational scope, the documentation methodology, the timeline. The patient intervention, Dion Tapper, was referenced by name, and somewhere in the audience, a small sound came, a woman who Serena realized, with a slight tightening in her chest, must be Tapper's mother, who had apparently driven 6 hours from Billings for this, and whom nobody had warned Serena about. Commendation used language that was formal and a little stiff in the way of official documents, which was appropriate for official documents. Said what happened. It said that it was right. It said that it mattered. Then Whitford set the document down and looked up and said, in a voice slightly less official than the document, "For what it's worth, in 30 years of this work, I have rarely seen documentation this complete and this clean, assembled under this degree of active interference. That's not in the formal record. It's just true." The room was quiet for a moment. Then it wasn't. Serena stood at the front of the room and received it without performing. She didn't cry, which wasn't because she wasn't affected. She was affected. Had been affected since the moment she'd walked into this building and started the work. Had been carrying the accumulated weight of 6 weeks of isolation and hostility and careful maintenance of a cover that required her to absorb things that were genuinely hard to absorb. But the tears, if they came later and privately. And what she gave the room now was the thing she'd been giving it all along. Her actual self, steady present, unembellished. She said, "Thank you. The work was necessary. I'm glad it's done," which was exactly the right length. Tapper was discharged from the recovery ward 4 days after the ceremony. He walked out under his own power, which his treating physician had placed at approximately 60% probability. On the morning he'd come in, his mother was there again. The same woman from the briefing hall, small and sharp-eyed, and holding it together, with the particular tension of someone who has been very frightened for a long time and is only now beginning to believe the fear is over. Serena was passing the ward entrance when they came out, which was genuinely coincidental and not something she'd staged, because she wasn't someone who staged things. Tapper saw her from 10 feet away and stopped. He was 22, lean, with the cautious movement of someone whose body had recently reminded him of its limits. He looked at her for a moment with the specific expression of someone who has been told a thing and is now confronting the actual person the thing is about. "You're Voss," he said. Yes, he was quiet for a second. His mother was looking between them. "They told me what you did," he said, "in the trauma bay." "Marin did most of the work," she said. He shook his head. "That's not what he said." She held his gaze. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got blown up," he said. "But breathing." He paused. "So better than the alternative." "Yes," she said, considerably. His mother stepped forward. She was maybe 55, with the kind of face that has lived through things and not been flattened by them. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she reached out and took Serena's hand in both of hers and held it, which was not something Serena had anticipated, and which required a specific kind of stillness to receive. "Thank you," Tapper's mother said. "Just that." Serena nodded. "Take care of him." "I have been for 22 years, the woman said. "I'm not stopping now." They walked out. Serena stood in the corridor and let that sit. 3 days before her official reassignment, Marcus Teal came to her office for the last time. He knocked, which he had never done in the early weeks. The evolution of that detail was not lost on her. "I heard you're being transferred," he said. "Yes." "Where?" "I'm not supposed to say," she said. "True, but also meant, I wouldn't tell you even if I could, and you should understand why that's not personal." He understood. She could see it. "Right." He stood in the doorway, with his hands at his sides in the same posture he'd used in the 230 conversation, the posture of restraint, which she'd come to recognize as what he looked like when he was making himself be careful rather than reactive. "I received my formal reprimand." "I know." It goes in the file. It'll affect my next evaluation cycle. He wasn't saying this with bitterness. He was saying it in the manner of someone reporting a consequence they accept. I'm not asking you to do anything about it. I just wanted you to know he stopped. I'm not looking for you to fix it. I wouldn't, she said. It's accurate. Yeah, he half smiled. Something that crossed his face briefly rueful, a little tired. Yeah, it is. She looked at him. You changed, once you had the information. Not fast enough, but you changed. Doesn't undo what I did. No, she said. But it's part of the record, too. He nodded. He stood for a moment more in the doorway of the office that had hosted 6 weeks of the most complicated professional experience of his career, and he looked at the concrete wall window and the desk, and the blank coffee mug and the shelves she'd organized in her first week, and maintained through everything that followed. He was looking at it, the way people look at a place right before they know they'll stop seeing it. The soldiers, he said. The ones who watch the cafeteria. Talk to them. Like you said. How did that go? Uncomfortable, he said. They asked a lot of questions. He paused. Good questions. I didn't have good answers to all of them. He looked at her. Think that's probably the right outcome. It is, she said. He walked to the door. At the threshold he stopped and looked back, and his expression was the clearest she'd ever seen it cleared of performance, the chest-forward authority, of the specific armor that gets built up over 11 years of being the largest presence in any room. Just a man who had been wrong about something that mattered and was still figuring out what to do with that. You were the best person in this building, he said, from day one. It just took the rest of us way too long to see it. She held his gaze. Don't make it about seeing me, she said. Make it about what you do next. He was quiet. Then he nodded once and walked away down the corridor. She listened to his footsteps until they were gone. On her last night at Harlow Peak, Priya brought 2 real coffees from a place in Duskfield, not the facility canteen, and they sat in the supply office for the last time with the desk lamp on and the Montana dark pressing against the concrete wall window. Where do you actually go? Priya asked. Somewhere that needs what I do, Serena said. Priya turned the coffee cup in her hands. You know, when you first got here, I thought you were... She stopped. Thought you were someone who'd given up. You were so quiet, so contained. I thought something bad had happened and you'd just gone, she gestured. Inward. Something bad did happen, Serena said, before I got here. And you went inward. For a while. She looked at the window. And then I came here and found something worth coming back out for. Priya was quiet for a moment. Is that what this is? Coming back out? Part of it. Serena wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. The other part is that the work is real. Those supplies were going to soldiers who needed them. The person running the extraction didn't think of them as people. They thought of them as a margin on a procurement contract. Making that visible, making it stop, that's real. That matters independent of whatever it did for me. But it did do something for you. Serena thought about that honestly. About the cafeteria floor and the cooling soup and the 50 faces watching to see what she would do. About 6 weeks of writing things down in a notebook while people told her she didn't understand how things worked here. About Tapper walking out of the recovery ward under his own power. And Morrow's voice on the phone saying, I've always known your statement was accurate. And the way the room had sounded on that Thursday afternoon in the briefing hall. Yes, she said, it did. Priya looked at her directly. Are you okay? Actually. Serena considered the question seriously, the way it deserved. I'm functional, she said. I'm more okay than I was when I arrived. There are things I'm still working through that this didn't fix, because they're different things. She paused. But yes, I'm okay. Priya nodded. She looked satisfied with the answer, which was the right response to an honest one. Put in for a transfer, Priya said. Serena looked at her. Not because of this, Priya said quickly. Or not only because of this. I've been thinking about it for a while. There's a program at Walter Reed that does trauma response and emergency preparedness. I applied before any of this happened. I got word today. You got in? I got in. She smiled, and it was the first unguarded smile Serena had seen on her face in 6 weeks. I leave in 5 weeks. Good, Serena said, and meant it completely. They sat with their coffees until they were gone. Didn't try to make it more than it was. Two people who had gone through something significant together and were now going in different directions, which was not a sad thing. It was what happened when situations resolved. People moved. The work continued somewhere else. At some point, the conversation ran down naturally, and Prius stood and collected her cup, and they said goodbye in the brief way of people who don't need to make it ceremonial because the work already was. After she left, Serena sat alone for a while. She thought about the thing nobody had asked her, which was whether it had been worth it, the assignment, the cover, the 6 weeks of deliberate invisibility, the daily act of absorbing hostility from people who thought they understood what they were looking at and understood nothing, whether the outcome justified the method, whether she'd do it again. She knew the answer, and it wasn't simple, because the simple answers were for people who didn't have to sit in small offices and make them. Yes, it was worth it, because Tapper was breathing, and the supply chain was documented, and Steck was cooperating, and Caldwell Meridian was burning down through 4 states. Yes, and also it cost something. It always cost something. The 6 weeks of careful stillness, of absorbing the cafeteria and the threats, and the 245 meeting, and all of it without flinching outwardly, while something inward worked to absorb the impact that cost something real. Not permanent, not unfixable, but real. The cost of choosing the work over the comfort of being seen. Cost of knowing things you can't say until the moment arrives. She'd pay it again. But she'd stop pretending it wasn't a payment. That was the thing about strength that didn't announce itself. It wasn't free. It wasn't effortless. It didn't sit in a supply office for 6 weeks, feeling nothing and emerging unaffected. It sat in the office and felt everything and kept going anyway. Not because keeping going was natural, but because the reason to keep going was larger than the difficulty of doing it. That wasn't a movie version of strength, but it was the actual version. She was packed and ready at 5:45, and the drive to the airport was 2 hours. And the car she'd arranged was civilian, no facility vehicle, no military escort, just a rental she'd booked herself. She was carrying 1 bag, which was what she'd arrived with. She stopped at the supply room on her way out. She wasn't sure why. Exactly, there was nothing left in it that belonged to her. The shelves were stocked, the cabinets reorganized, the inventory system running on corrected records overseen by a DCIS appointed interim coordinator who had asked her, in their brief handover conversation, how she'd set up the tracking template. She'd explained it clearly and in full, the same way she'd explained everything for 6 weeks. Nothing withheld, nothing simplified, just the work, transferred to the next person who needed it. The office was dark and clean. The desk was clear. The blank coffee mug was gone. She'd left it in the break room, because it had never been hers, and there was no point carrying something that didn't belong to you. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she turned off the light and walked down the corridor, through the main entrance, past the MP post and the bulletin board and the reception desk that was just beginning to stir with the 600 shift arriving, and she pushed through the outer door and walked into the Montana, cold, and loaded her 1 bag into the rental car and drove away from Harlow Peak Military Medical Center without looking back. Not because she didn't care, because she did, and she'd already done everything that caring required. The road into Duskfield was dark, the mountains beginning to outline themselves against the first gray suggestion of sunrise. The heater in the rental was slow to catch, so she drove with her jacket on and her hands steady on the wheel, watching the road and thinking about the next posting and what would be waiting there. What kind of quiet room? What kind of institutional assumption? What kind of person who would look at her and see only what they expected? She thought about what she'd tell them, if she could tell them anything. She'd tell them this: the most dangerous assumption you can make about a person is that you've already understood them, that the category you've put them in is accurate and complete, that the person who files the paperwork and keeps the shelves stocked and absorbs your contempt without visible reaction is absorbing it because they have no other option. Sometimes they're absorbing it because they're taking note. Sometimes the quietest person in the building is the one who will still be standing when everything you thought was assault has been picked apart and documented and handed to the people whose job it is to make it stop. That's not a comfort for the people who need to hear it. It's a warning. But for the people who are living it, for anyone sitting in a small office with a concrete wall window, writing things down while the room outside arranges itself against them, holding on to the work when the work is the only thing that makes sense, it's something else. It's evidence that the position they're in is not the end of the story. It's evidence that patient and invisible and underestimated are not permanent conditions, and that the slow, careful building of irrefutable truth is, in the end, the most powerful thing a person can bring into a room. It doesn't always win cleanly. It doesn't always win fast. The outcomes are negotiated and imperfect, and the cost is real, and you carry the Rosario Vends of your history with you, because they deserve to be carried. But it wins. The road opened up ahead of her as the sun crested the mountains, and the light came sideways in gold across the flatland and hit the windshield, and she had to put the visor down to see. She drove toward it anyway.